Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into one of the most critical, completely data-driven corners of global industry, how massive oil and gas refineries are actually forced to track their climate impact. And listen, we aren't just talking about a couple of smokestacks here. We're talking about colossal operations processing hundreds of thousands of barrels every single day. So to measure their true environmental footprint in a way that's standardized, totally rigid, and transparent, we rely on the SASB standard, specifically tailored for refining and marketing. Today, we're going to dissect exactly how these industrial giants must calculate and report their gross, global Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions down to the very last metric ton of CO2 equivalent and how they disclose their actual regulatory risk. Here's our roadmap. We're going to take a macro to micro funnel approach to digest these complex rules, starting with the emissions challenge, defining Scope 1, doing the carbon math, establishing the boundaries, and finally, quantifying the regulatory reality.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the Refining Emissions Challenge.
To really understand the reporting side of things, we first have to understand the reality on the ground. Refining operations have just a massive energy footprint. Heating, cracking, processing petroleum products, it all generates significant greenhouse gas emissions. And this is coming from everywhere. Stationary fossil fuel combustion, fugitive emissions from equipment leaks, venting, flaring, even those non-routine maintenance events. Because energy costs take up such a massive chunk of operating expenses here, tracking these emissions isn't just an environmental thing. It's absolutely crucial for operational efficiency. Enter the SASB standards, which are now part of the IFRS Foundation. This framework is the rigid, mathematical solution required for corporate reporting. It basically forces an apples-to-apples comparison for investors and completely crushes greenwashing by demanding hard mathematical data.
Moving right along to Section 2, defining Scope 1 emissions. Let's break down some of this industry jargon.
I want you to mentally picture a sprawling refinery complex. Miles of pipes, huge towers, marine vessels coming and going, massive fleets of tank trucks. When a company is asked to report its direct climate impact, what actually goes into Scope 1? It's a really high-stakes reporting audit, so the boundaries here matter immensely.
Well, the standard definitely doesn't leave this up to interpretation. It strictly mandates that Scope 1 emissions are defined and calculated using the methodology from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Basically, this means we're looking at direct emissions of greenhouse gases from stationary or mobile sources. If the refinery owns or controls the equipment, whether that's a giant cracking unit, a fleet of marine vessels, or mobile rigs, it absolutely counts. Simply put, if you operate it, you own its atmospheric impact.
But hey, it's not just about carbon dioxide, right? A refinery's chemical footprint is super complex. The standard demands the consolidation of 7 very specific greenhouse gases covered under the Kyoto Protocol. So we're talking carbon dioxide and methane, sure, but also nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, which, by the way, is incredibly potent, and nitrogen trifluoride. Every single valve and flare that contributes to any of these 7 must be mathematically accounted for, no exceptions.
That brings us to Section 3, calculating carbon equivalents. This is where we hit the mathematical challenge.
Think about it. How in the world you add 7 totally different gases together? A ton of methane doesn't trap nearly the same amount of heat as a ton of CO2. To solve this, the standard uses what is basically a currency exchange for greenhouse gases. Just like you'd convert euros, yen, and pesos into a single baseline currency like the US dollar to understand total wealth, refineries need a single carbon currency to report their total emissions impact.
And the methodology for this is a brilliant, strict 3-step process. First, you identify the raw volume of the specific gas emitted. Second, you apply the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 100-year Global Warming Potential Multiplier. That's essentially your exchange rate, measuring the heat trapped over a century. Third, your output. All emissions are mathematically converted and disclosed in metric tons of CO2 equivalent. This gives regulators and investors one clean, undeniable number representing the total warming impact.
Okay, Section 4, establishing the boundary. Once you've got that final metric ton number, the SASB standard draws a very strict line.
And that strict line comes down to one word: gross. The standard demands the disclosure of gross global Scope 1 emissions. This means the raw, unfiltered emissions pumped into the atmosphere before applying any offsets. A refinery cannot just buy a forest halfway across the world and use those credits to magically erase their operational emissions on this line item. There's literally no hiding here. No creative accounting allowed.
What really makes this whole thing airtight is how the physical environmental data must perfectly mirror the financial data.
Under this standard, if you claim financial control over an asset on your balance sheet, you own its emissions on your sustainability report. You can't just shuffle some dirty, high-emitting asset off your books to a shadowy subsidiary just to make your environmental report look a bit cleaner. It ensures a totally raw, unvarnished look at the atmospheric impact of the business exactly as it financially exists.
Which brings us to the very bottom of the funnel. Section 5, the regulatory reality.
So we have our massive gross global emissions calculated in CO2 equivalents. But how much of that is actually being policed by the government? The standard requires companies to disclose the exact percentage covered under an emissions limiting regulation. We're talking strict cap-and-trade schemes or direct carbon taxes. Voluntary trading systems or simple reporting-only rules? Yeah, those don't count here at all.
Imagine a scenario where 60% of a refinery's gross emissions are trapped under strict regulatory exposure. That means they carry an active, legal cost right now, today. The other 40% aren't covered. For an investor, seeing this exact percentage is pure gold. It instantly quantifies the company's real financial risk to current and future climate legislation, because that uncovered 40%, that is an unpriced, looming financial liability just waiting to drop.
Ultimately, the SASB standard for refining leaves absolutely zero room for ambiguity. From defining the 7 different gases, to mandating that global warming potential math, to tying gross emissions directly to financial control, it forces the truth out into the open. It practically asks every refinery, does your reporting reveal the raw truth of your regulatory risk? Because in an era where carbon literally equals cost, this kind of data-driven honesty is really the only viable way to navigate the industry's economic future. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the data.